Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my name is Alexander Lukin. I'm the head of Department of International Relations and the Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism at National Research University Higher School of Economics. And today we're having our 14th session of Eurasian Online Seminar with Professor Sergey Karaganov. We are delighted to have my boss, I'm especially delighted, Professor Karaganov, and the head of the Dean of Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. Well, the thing is that we started this seminar, the idea, when we started it during this pandemic, we wanted to to listen to the voices of world's top international relations experts and analysts, and to present their views to our Russian audience, especially, of course, our university students and faculty. But then we began having a lot of participants from abroad, and we thought, well, why we should always have only foreigners? We in Russia also have first-class foreign policy analysts. And of course, the best of them is Professor Karaganov. So we invited him and he agreed to speak today to us in English. And we're very happy about it. I'll introduce him formally. Professor Karaganov is Dean of the Faculty of World Economy and International Relations at Higher School of Economics and an honorary chairman of the Presidium of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. He is also chairman of the Editorial Board of the Russia in Global Affairs Journal, co-founder and former deputy director of the Institute of Europe of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He authored more than 25 books and around 500 articles. Professor Karaganov is also a member of the Academic Council of the Russian Foreign Ministry, member of the Academic and Advisory Council of the Russian Security Council, a member of the Council for the Development of Civil Society and Human Rights under the President of Russia. In the 1990s, he was a member of the Presidential Council of Russia, and in 2014-2015 of the high-level panel of eminent persons on European security as a common project under the OSCE. In the 2005 Global Intellectuals Poll, he was the only intellectual from the former Soviet Union and only one of 4 from Eastern Europe, or 100 people listed there. And this is, of course, not because we don't have other clever people, but because they are biased towards us. So thank you very much, Professor Karaganov, that you are with us today. The floor is yours.
First, of course, thank you very much, Professor Lukin. Of course, I am not the best. You are the best, and many others are also excellent. So, but I take your statement that I'm the best as a kind of a tongue-in-cheek argument. Of course, you know that I'm not the boss. I'm trying to be one among others. Hopefully, I'm useful to you all. When we were debating with Professor Lukin the subject of this lecture, the natural thing was, of course, to speak about what will come out of the international system of the coronavirus, what are the reasons for this crisis in international affairs. But after some thinking, I decided not to dwell on that subject. First of all, rephrasing for famous Zhou Enlai, statement when he was asked about his assessment of the French Revolution. He said allegedly that it was too early to judge, and it is clear for me that it is too early to judge about the effects of the current crisis. One thing is clear is that this crisis was partly self-inflicted. It is not about, largely it's not about virus, though of course the epidemics is there, but it is has deep political, economic, social, and psychological roots, and we are only at the beginning of the unraveling of the chain of events which have been triggered by these epidemics, but which were, but the avalanche was ready to start off a few years ago. So for this lecture, we have decided with Professor Lukin that I will take the subject of correlation of military preponderance and economic power. This subject for me has a very interesting history. For many years, or for quite a few years, let's put it this way, I have been stating just offhandedly that the major source of the Western preponderance in the world and then the demise of this was of and this dominance in economic culture or politics was its military superiority, and that Russia doing away with this military superiority has basically undermined the foundation of that of that system. And I was mentioning that just offhandedly until some of my younger colleagues started to question me, how did I come to this conclusion? For me, it was absolutely obvious. And then I decided to do some research and some reading on that, and found that actually almost nobody ever wrote, or maybe I didn't find, or my assistant didn't find, the proof of that statement in international relations literature or thinking. So I went deeper and deeper, and I found only one citation, I think, by Lord Skidelsky, the famous British economist and political philosopher, who stated in one of his articles that if you believe that it was Christianity or which was was the root of the Western domination, no, he said it was power. So I did some thinking, and now I will share with you some of the ideas, of course, in a very sketchy way, but hopefully we shall debate my thesis, because I'm still in the midst of thinking and working on the subject, and maybe some of my students or students in other universities will follow on, and we shall have a disproof of this thesis, which is for me, or hypothesis, which is for me absolutely evident. But let us go right to the center of the problem. First of all, I decided to look into the literature on why the West has won. And after browsing and through some of the major works on that subject, I found that the list is interesting. Now I will go down the list, and then I will explain why I didn't take this reasoning. First, it was race. Of course, now the race has been, in this politically correct time, the race was pushed aside. Then it was democracy. Then it was their level of science. Then a level of medicine, of medical system. Then our Christian work ethics. And then, of course, defense of property rights. There were one or two other reasons which are mentioned by various writers, but these are the main. What struck me was, of course, that all of these reasons seem to be, let's put it mildly, incorrect. Not all but one. Let's start with democracy. And democracy is one of the ways of governing societies, as we all know, and also when the West became predominant in the world, it was some of the states were perfunctory or superficial democratic by any more normal standards or modern standards. They were highly authoritarian. Then Christianity, Christian work ethics. Yes, to a certain extent, but only in the Protestant part of Europe or the West, because so democracy. One, as I've said, it's one of the ways of governing societies, the most comfortable, obviously, but it has been going and coming and going, and obviously the Europe came to its flourishing period not during democracy. During the last year, of course, it had a great period of liberal democracy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Yeah, but now, as we all see, it is going under. Christianity, I've already mentioned that. Medicine. It is absolutely clear that medical science in the Arab world and to what, as far as I know, in Chinese world, was far more developed in the 16th century. So one, the science, of course, started to develop in Europe since 17th, 18th, especially 19th century. But one of the reasons of this development was also not only the relative freedom of scientific knowledge, but also the fact that Europe has become, by that time, richer and was able to channel some more funds into scholarly research. Also, we all know that during the medieval times and even the early Renaissance times, science was in many cases persecuted in Europe by Inquisition. So the only clear reasoning for European success was, of course, the rule of law. There is no question about that, and the property and the fact that Europe inherited Roman legal system, then which developed through the feudal ages, and which protected property rights. That is one of the reasons. There are many. There are, of course, some others. And Europe developed in the end, I mean, highly developed medicine and highly developed science. But it was not probably the reason. So I was absolutely amazed during my research that almost nobody except for Lord Skidelsky, who I mentioned, ever mentioned the fact that Europe succeeded, Europe and the West succeeded so well, largely from my point of view, but not, of course, overwhelmingly, because of its military preponderance and its ability to use this military preponderance as a base for its economic, political, and cultural expansions. It all started. It all started in the around the 16th century. Before that, Europe, as we all know, particularly in the 16th century, Europe was a relatively poor area of the world where, while poor Europeans were constantly trying to go east to through crusades, allegedly for ideological and religious reasons, but also largely, of course, as we all know, to rob the more affluent Eastern and Byzantine civilization. Why Europe has developed military power so well? For that, on that, I have found some interesting literature, and which supported my original quote-unquote suspicion. Europe, as well know, powder was created in China. Guns too, but Europe, since the 14th, 15th, 16th century, because it was so overcrowded and constant, and had to wage constant wars with each other, developed better military technologies and military organization. And that was, from my point of view, their foundation of the success of Europe worldwide, and its ability to subdue many sometimes very developed civilizations like the Aztec, or in Latin America, like eventually like in China, many in the Arabic world and in India. There was a very interesting episode in the 15th century, which of course our Chinese specialists know extremely well. China, by mid 15th century or early 15th century, had a fleet which overwhelmingly was absolutely overwhelming. When the famous eunuch Admiral, I think Jude, or so, I think I'm citing correctly his name, sailed all the way to Arabia and Africa. His fleet consisted of 100 plus ships, and his largest ship was 140 meters long and 50 meters wide. It's almost like an air carrier. And of course, if Chinese would have continued with that expansion, we would have been all of us talking Mandarin and not English. But for yet quite unknown reasons, the Chinese started to withdraw. The fleet was burned in the mid 15th century, and almost simultaneously, the Portuguese and the Spaniards, the Dutch, and the Brits started to arrive, subduing local nations, local tribes, and plundering them. The system of outright robbery first, then colonial exploitation was inflicted on most of Asia and Africa, and eventually on parts of Latin America, which provided as a basis for siphoning off the world GNP in favor of Europe, later the West. And what I'm saying sounds anti-European. No. Russia did absolutely the same. If we just try to remember our own history from late 15th century, for about 70 years, Russian Cossacks conquered the Asian part of what became Grand Russia or Russian Empire. It is unbelievable how they did that, and of course we don't know exactly what was moving them, because it was not exactly the orders of the imperial court, or at that time a Tsarist court. It was probably they were seeking wealth, freedom, or else they had this very strange Russian spirit, always searching for something over the horizon, It is in Russia. It is called volia, which is not exactly freedom. But however, they conquered all these Asian lands in 70 years, reached the Pacific Ocean, providing the basis for survival and expansion of the Russian state. Furs and silver, but above all, at the beginning, of course, it was furs, provided a large part of the cash which Russian Tsarist court and then imperial court used to fight the Western competitors and to fund its expansion westward and southward. One excellent example of that I found in a book of a Russian very talented who said that actually, it was in Alexei Zivanov, a famous novel Tabol, who said that eventually one caravan of Chinese silk, china, and tea, which was exchanged for Russian furs, provided the imperial coffers with enough money to fully arm a regiment in Peter's time. So we participated in that kind of a European quote-unquote expansion extremely actively. Of course, Russian expansion was a bit different for all kinds of reasons which have to be explored further. Russians not only conquered and exploited, but also did it in a different manner from most European nations. Maybe because of the history of being subdued by Genghis Khan empire, which robbed, but not imposed culture or religion. Russian expansion was much more culturally tolerant. But however, it was European. So things started to change at the beginning of the 20th century when a Bolshevik revolution and then the Chinese revolution carved part of the world out of Western domination. We all know how communists were and Bolsheviks were hated in the outside world, and we know what they did to our country. But internationally, they provided for a bit more freedom for many nations. The Bolsheviks, with their communist internationalism, supported anti-colonial struggle openly, clandestinely, which contributed to the demise of the empire, of European empires. But the main, I would say, sea change came at the beginning of the 50s, when Soviet Union created nuclear weapons. And then 10 years after, or at least more than 10 years after, China developed nuclear weapons. And that was probably the most important structural reason or structural factor which influenced the history of the 20th century. That statement could be questioned. Some would argue that it was October Socialist Revolution. Some others will give different examples. But for me, it is absolutely clear that nuclear weapons changed the course of humanity, and second, eventually the fate of the West. The fact the nuclear weapons made big wars impossible, and escalation became profoundly unpalatable. And Americans didn't win the war in Korea, and also because they were afraid not only of Chinese avalanche but also because they wrongly, as I know from my studies of strategic history, they wrongly believed that the Soviet Union had a serious nuclear arsenal at the beginning of the 50s. It was numbered maybe by 5, 10, 15 warheads, not more. And of course, the United States lost Vietnam War, also unable to go for escalation. After that, Arab oil embargo was also a powerful hit at the Western dominance in the international system. But even before that, on the basis of the Western dominance, of the US dominance, especially military dominance in the Western part of the international system, a new system of, I would say, much more sophisticated exploitation was formed on the basis of dollar, Bretton Woods system. We all know that. Now it is crumbling, which also provided for a possibility of neo-colonial plundering of, at that time, of the non-Soviet or non-socialist world. The reaction to the serious defeats of the Western powers, and especially of the United States in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was, of course, the Reagan Revolution or counter-revolution. It is remembered now mostly by the willingness of Reagan, very much like Donald Trump, to resurrect the American economy, which hit it. But also, it was accompanied by a drive towards restoration of military superiority. Probably by that time, it was already unachievable. But for a historic moment, an illusion was created that it could be achieved. Soviet Union. I know that most of my listeners are Russians, so I don't have to explain that, or we could discuss that later in the period of debate and questions and answers. Collapsed. It collapsed economically, politically, and morally. It collapsed largely because of its inner weaknesses. And also, of course, because of the fact that by that time, the communist idea, which was the foundation of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet Empire, went flat. And the country without an idea inevitably, especially the empire, inevitably collapsed, which we did. So for immediately, a very interesting thing happened. Soviet Union, also because of its economic weaknesses, because of the collapse of its military forces, and because of its military weakness and ensuing stupidity, stopped deterring the West. And all of a sudden we saw that what was happening, that democratic countries which were believed to be peaceful by definition started a series of aggressions. The rape of Yugoslavia, Iraq, then Libya. But at that time, two mistakes, strategic mistakes. One of profound historic nature, one a lighter one, were committed by our Western partners. One was, of course, the rejection of the appeal of Russia to join the West. Most of the Russian elites at the end of the 80s and at the beginning of and in the 90s wanted to join the West, but as a junior, but independent and sovereign partner. That status was not given, Russia, as we know, was rejected. The offer was fantastically generous. It was so generous that we were rejected when Russia was rejected, and that was very much a part of that political drive of Russia to integrate with the West, not into the West, but with the West. I became fearful, believing that the West is was preparing for delivering a coup d'etat, finishing off Russia. So I remember very well that in the Council of Foreign Defense Policy, which I was then head, and some members of the council I see with great pleasure here, we were meeting and saying to each other, I mean, let's smile, let's wait, let's wait the time, because if we become too provocative, they will finish us off. But it was not vicious plan to finish off Russia. It was stupidity and greed. But if Russia would have been invited into the West, the ensuing collapse of the Western influence would not have happened, because the military might of Russia and its strategic culture would have been on the side of the West. Just imagine what would be the map of the world if Russia wouldn't have rejected. We wouldn't have most of the Asian century. We wouldn't have meteoric rise of China, now at least which is almost unstoppable. But that happened. The second mistake was done in 1999. It was a small mistake. In order to show off its new force and also of arrogance and covered, or maybe not exactly covered, maybe rationalized by humanitarian arguments, the West bombed Yugoslavia. That was the turning point. After that, most of the Russian elite, including those who you would have been calling Westernizers and liberals, said, "Oh no, not anymore." It is a repetition of what could happen to Russia. And most of the Russian elite turned against the West. We were not telling that, and Putin coming even continued to maneuver for a year or two. He even semi-applied to NATO membership. He smiled, but after 202, things, the threshold Rubicon was crossed. That was the withdrawal of from the ABM treaty, which showed clearly for those who were still hesitant that the United States are opting for overall strategic preponderance. And that it was at that time when all these famous now high-tech systems were ordered, which are now being deployed and which were first shown by Putin in 2018. After 2008, Russia started a serious military reform, and so by the mid of the 2010s, it had a viable military force, conventional force, plus, of course, reinvigorated strategic systems. Two more blows were delivered to the Western preponderance. One was Crimea. The West hated what happened there, but it couldn't do anything. Russia was already militarily too strong. The question of any use of force was even not contemplated, of course, apart from radical thinkers in the United States and very few in Europe. And then, of course, Syria, which stopped, among many other things, the chain of the color revolutions inflicted from outside. And that is exactly from mid 2000s, and especially from the crisis of 2008, when the system of the Western domination in economy, politics, culture started to crumble, and it is crumbling with an accelerated pace in front of our eyes. But while doing away with because that system, as I argue, was based eventually, through many layers, of course, on the military predominance, which US has had for about 500 years. All of a sudden, it come to the minds of our Western, especially American friends, that liberal economic order without the foundation of military preponderance is not so profitable, because others could compete on equal terms, and the flow of the world GNP started to go in the other direction, not in the direction of the West, still goes there, but more and more in the direction of the developing world and Russia and non-West. By the way, I mean, of course, I could give you a few examples how military power or military preponderance was used within the Western grouping, if needed to inflict the will of the predominant power. The clearest example is, of course, the suffocating of Japan in mid 1980s. However, that has happened, and when Russia is now being accused that it is a revisionist power and it undermines the liberal world order, many Russian pundits reject it. I do not share their views. We undermined it. We were the reason, or one of the reasons, one of the main reasons, not the reason, of course, one of the main reasons of the demise of the Western preponderance in the world politics, economy, culture, ideology. But we did that not knowing what we were doing. We were catering for our own security. Russia is overwhelmingly security-oriented country, as we all know, because of our history. And by securing our security, I'm sorry for tautology, we became the midwife of history. In the meantime, it's not only that we helped to bring in the dawn of the Western dominance, we also helped the world in a different way. Russia is not a very free country, as we all know, and has never been. Right now, it is in one of the freest moments in its history. But doing away with the military preponderance of the West, it freed nations of the world from what I would call, half jokingly, the Western yoke. Now countries have a much more wider possibility all over the world to pursue their own economic, political, and cultural paths independently. The world is becoming much more sovereign. So where are we going? We have moved into a much freer, much more interesting, much more multifaceted world. The period of transition to this world, which is called chaos, will be relatively long, and we have to survive it. And our friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and which are here, and also our friends in the Ministry of Defense, have to steer us through this years, actually of very dangerous instability. But in the end, the world will be much freer, much more interesting, much more versatile. I'm not sure whether I will survive to see it being so brilliant and multifaceted as I foresee. But I like the picture, which will come eventually. Of course, I gave only the sketch of my thinking and writing on this subject, and I will continue. But here I would like to stop and to call for your criticisms, questions, and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm turning the microphone of Professor Lukin to moderate
Yes,
the session.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor Karaganov. Let's check if we have any questions here. Could you please write your questions to the chat so I can see the order of them? Well, at the moment we have Dr. Sergey Trush, who wanted to make a comment. Dr. Trush? Yes, yes, yes. Could you switch on his microphone?
Yeah, I'm turning, yeah.
All right, all right.
Do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon once again. Well, I was very much interested to hear Professor Karaganov's talk. Professor Karaganov is a prominent expert in the field. We can call him to a certain extent one of the prominent ideologies of the Russian foreign policy at the moment. And therefore, there is the interests to his views. He was mainly speaking on the historical perspective of the very important and systemic revolution in military affairs and the influence of it on the geopolitical and geoeconomic sphere. And he also touched on the more acute issues of Russian foreign policy. Probably the talk was more historic, but Professor Karaganov, as we know, is writing a lot on the current issues of Russian foreign policy, and therefore there is a possibility to judge on his thinking of that, on general thinking of that. Quoting one of the recent solid work on the assessment and the new ideas for the Russian foreign policy, I mean the latest Council of Foreign and Defense Policy Committee report that was called Defense of Peace, Earth, Freedom of Choice, etc. I think Professor Karaganov and all the audience could probably noticed this document. This document has quite distinct qualifications of the certain foreign policy course of Russia. And upon this, we can judge on the main assessments of professor on its contemporary status. So to quote this, one of the most vivid qualifications to quote in this report was that, well, Russian foreign policy now is extremely successful. This is page 9 of this report. Also, I noticed a professor being interested in military history, in military evolution of military sphere. He is quoting sometimes quite famous Mao Zedong's quotation, like the power comes out of the barrel of the gun. We know very well this Mao Zedong's maxim. So logically connecting this qualifications, if the person want to ask to what extent the expert, the distinguished expert, is satisfied with how this gun, in what hands this gun is being possessed, and how well it is being used, as like the qualifying the military defense security part of Russian foreign policy, we can feel that as far as I can understand this text, that professor is satisfied with it. So, and in this very realm, I would want to say that I would seriously disagree with such kind of qualification. And I will explain why. Well, I think that recently, with 30 years of post-communist development in Russia, we are witnessing the evolution to the unjust, unhealthy, and socially very fractured society and polity. The elite is not trying to even pretend to build the socially oriented state in this country, in the civilized understanding of this notion. It doesn't pretending to build up to this or that extent effective dialogue within this fractured society. The society is driven with sharp material disparities. It is actually the new class society that we are witnessing. And this society is being controlled by the state capitalism oligarchy, with the very large and very distinct imprint of the former Secret Service clans. So we do understand that the external environment of Russia is very difficult, and all our partners, the states, China, they are not the angels. They have their own interests. They are pursuing sharp competition with Russia And in these circumstances, we do have a need to keep the powder dry. We do really need the modernization of our military complexes. We do need our vanguard complexes. We do need our Kinjal complexes. I don't know how to.
Tiger.
Yes. So we do need our modern supersonic and high precision weapon system. We do need all this. And we also do understand that all this, our key partners in the world, the States and China, are experiencing the wave of international nationalism, of different motivations within these different countries, but still we can know that all these countries are experiencing this wave of nationalism. We are dealing with this situation, but at the same time, we were not giving the order to current regime of Putin to go to Crimea, to restore the quasi-patriotic ideology either internally.
Could you make it shorter, please? Because we have quite a few other people who want to speak.
Okay, so so I'm just saying that on these are the situation we are against it, where the personalities, well, there's quite a certain extent of expert community and the society is against it. So I'm just summing up saying that I'm not saying that the Russian foreign policy is totally successive. It could be said only if you are supporting the interests of a certain community in this certain section in this society. There is not a vast section of this society. Thank you.
First, second, I have been defending Soviet Union, although I knew the immorality of that system. I have been defending the interests of democratic Russia, so-called democratic Russia, although I know that that rule was a disaster. And I'm defending Russia in its present form. And I'm quite sure that those of us who will be able to keep Russia afloat and powerful, independent, sovereign will prevail in the end. That is a philosophical or metaphysical answer. As to our military might, it could not substitute for economic, for vibrant economy and vibrant society. That is true, but it's up to you to create this vibrant economy and vibrant society. We have survived an absolute disaster, which was close to 1917. We have survived. We are resurrecting ourselves. We have slowed down for the last 10 years, and I'm writing. But I think we are doing extremely well. I do not like the current Russian system of affairs, but it is the best of the worst. Well, maybe even the best of the possible. And maybe in 10 to 15 years, if we survive as a viable country, we will have a different forms of government, but the main thing is to survive, and to survive well in a very, very challenging world, as Professor Trush rightly said. So also I'm Russian, and if Professor Joseph Nye, an old friend, recently talking to this audience, never mentioned soft power. He invented soft power. What was soft power? It is the sympathy towards liberal, democratic, rich America. He didn't use, and nobody uses soft power anymore, except for our provincial thinkers and writers, because soft power of the United States is gone. But Joseph and I was emphasizing the strong competitive edge of that United States 10, 15 years ago. I'm emphasizing competitive edge of Russia, and that is clever diplomacy and limited and razor-like use of military force. It is not a substitute for everything else, but we're doing extremely well. And by going to Crimea, it was my only very vicious criticism of this step was it was too late. It should have been done before, because the confrontation was inevitable anyway. So we should have stopped the expansion of the Western alliances before. And second criticism, which is in that report too, is that we misused or wasted the great opportunity was created by the Crimea, this growth of national pride. We didn't use it for economic and moral advancement. We again went into stagnation. As to this report states that we are in an intellectual and moral, in a way, we're in an intellectual and moral dead ally, including in terms of foreign policy. We're not offering the world the picture which first the world would like, but also we would like. And exactly these three ideas, or there are some others, which we offered, and that is the Russia is the provider for freedom for all nations. Russia should be defender of the earth, which we are not. We didn't make it into our foreign policy, and also the fact that Russia is the major provider of security for the whole world. I think we should simply put that de facto policy into our concept of foreign policy. There are some other ideas, but if I would agree with you saying that this system is unfair, so we shouldn't defend it. Well, I think we wouldn't be talking in such a nice and a pleasant atmosphere. We would have long be in the midst of a civil war and disintegration. So foreign policy contributed to the survival of our country, and I'm proud of it.
Well, thank you very much. Let's have a historical question first, because you began from history, and it's from Olga Puzanova, who is a lecturer at our university. Olga.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to ask this. And thank you, Professor Karaganov, for presenting such an impressive, both in terms of scale and depth theory. If I'm allowed to summarize the extent to which I was able to grasp it. So you claim that the rise of the West was dependent on the military power. Now, I was therefore wondering if we could go even deeper than that and try to actually think of what stands behind that as well. So a good example in this case would be, since I teach the history of East Asia, China and Japan. So Japan was able to rise militarily in the 19th century after the Restoration, but it also borrowed everything else from the West first, like the education system and the constitution, and the very idea that the country needs to modernize. And then there was the military. Whereas China, on the other hand, in the 19th century, only wished to borrow the military technology towards the end of it and keep the rest of that ideology nonsense to the Westerners. So what happened was that they bought those guns and they borrowed the structure, but they couldn't actually do anything with it. They didn't know how to, and most importantly, they didn't know why they need to do that. So my question consequently is, could it be that this example shows us that there has to be much more than just a barrel of a gun, that there has to be more than the military, because even the basis for the military in itself stems from somewhere? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olga. Of course. I mean, I give only a sketch and a very, direct argumentation. Of course, cumulative power of the state of civilization is a extremely fluid interaction of many factors, including culture, economics, natural resources, territory, history, and of course, a moral power of the elite and of the nation. Power, you could not form a winning society on the basis of military power only. We tried to do that, by the way, and failed. Soviet Union was absolutely omnipotent, and it collapsed mostly because it overspent on military, the military in the 70s and in the 80s senselessly. And I remember how we with Vladimir Petrovich and our colleagues at the institutes were fighting this over militarization at that time. Olga, you are right. There is no question about that. But I will give you a further example. China, one of the greatest civilizations ever. After the Ming Dynasty, it destroyed its fleet, and during the Ming Dynasty also, it eventually freed itself, or swallowed their and digested the Mongols who had conquered it. By the way, Russians eventually threw them away. And then they did away with their tribes and Dzungars, which were threatening it from the northeast. And they forgot about the military. And the famous Chinese proverb that a good man would not be a soldier became a political reality. And they suffered for that in the 18th and especially in the 19th century, when a few gunboats with a few hundred European soldiers defeated huge, senseless, and very badly organized Chinese forces, and started 150 years of vicious exploitation and accumulation. So, if you want me to give a lecture on this correlation of various factors, I would be happy, but it would be a grand series of lectures. I did a very one-sided thing, but I hope I provoked you into thinking about other things too.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have Alexander Rar from Germany, a good friend. Alexander.
Well, hi. I put my question already on paper, so it's thank you for Sergey Karaganov for his brilliant talk, but I wanted to ask him about a very current issue, because Mrs. Merkel a couple of days ago said that the relations with Russia will develop according to a peaceful coexistence. This is Cold War language in my mind, but maybe I'm wrong. But my question is this maybe a favorable turn for Russia, because it can go away from that kind of value-oriented politics, which disturbed in many ways German or Western Russian relations, back to some kind of very crucial, cruel, if you want, honest pragmatism. And insofar, I mean, how important does Germany still also, Sergey is saying that the West is becoming less important on the world affairs, but what will he say about Germany's possible role in this new context? That was my
So, Sasha, you have to answer your question, not me, because you know the German picture much better than I do or anybody else. Thank you for the for the question. As to the peaceful coexistence, well, Mrs. Merkel is drifting in the right direction. When we turned east and then stopped Western expansion, and it started to turn east at that end of the 2000s, and stopped Western expansion in 14-15. We were thinking that eventually, after drastic change of correlation of political, moral, and economic correlation of forces between us and Europe, we would be again, eventually, reaching towards a rapprochement. I think that in 5 to 10 years, parts of Europe will be a part of a greater Eurasia, one way or another. Whether Germany, and I know where actually the dividing line is, Southern Europe, including France, will be drifting eastward. Not necessarily towards Ostpolitik, but eastward, because the magnetism of Asian markets and of Asian culture will be increasing. Northern Europe and Western Europe will be more or less America plus. The Germany is hanging in the balance again. But I'm happy that Mrs. Merkel is drifting in the right direction.
Thank you. Now we have Tamara Nezhina, who wanted to ask a question about the West. Tamara, are
That's
you
great. Thank you very much for your lecture. Maybe I should turn on my video. Okay, I'm not very presentable today because I was not ready. However, I'm very interested how independent Russia is today, you know, from the Western powers, and especially when they really want to try to push us in certain directions, you know, and we have to stand up and, you know, be independent. Do you think they have a lot of leverage, you know, to influence our policy? I mean, even internal country policy. Thank you.
We are dependent, everybody is dependent on everybody, of course, and we are still dependent very much on the West, especially on the United States technologically. We are still mostly on the US-led technological platform, drifting gradually towards the China-led technological platform, and hoping to find somewhere the third way, but it is clear we are still very much dependent. First. Second, we are much less dependent than we were 5, 10, 15, I'm not speaking about more than years ago, because the comprador, using my Chinese parallels, parts of our elite are shrinking, though there's still much there. The westernizers, which I used to be, are evaporating. Yeah. But in westernizers in a geopolitical part, sense of the word, because as you know, westernizers in the Russian culture were modernizers, but now modernizer is a person who drifts towards Asia, because I mean modernity, new modernity comes from there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I agree, and new modernity. But of course, we are not doing away with our European cultural roots at all. And we have done away with most of the elements of internal elements which made us dependent on the West. Of course, people were extremely unhappy about curtailment of the possibilities of Western organizations to fund our civil society. And in some cases, it was unfair because some of these monies were used for really humanitarian period. But now we all know that the West has very few possibilities, and that's why it uses only one element. It still has sanctions. It has no possibilities to pressure us militarily. There's no possibilities to pressure us ideologically. So it tries to pressure us economically. And of course, everything will depend on how we will eventually will develop inside the country. I'm extremely distressed by this current quagmire or intrigue around this corona, because it derails us from modernization and gives us an excuse not to do many things we plan to do and we were willing to do. But we'll see. As I have said, it's too early to judge.
Maybe we should be like Lukashenko, Lukashenko who said, to hell with this virus. I don't know it. I don't want to know about it. And they do what they do.
The things which I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation is that I will not talk about this hysteria.
Yeah.
Because I have very, very strong thoughts or beliefs on what is happening, but I'm not ready to share them publicly.
And the question about dollar, what do you think? Because somehow we are still dependent on this currency, and this currency is kind of world currency today.
Yes, we are dependent, and unfortunately we are still talking too much and doing too little. But yeah, of course, gradually we are becoming less and less dependent. And as you know, we've done away with dollar reserves in our funds. We're going towards gold and a bunch of other currencies. But it's a very gradual process, and the system, which was created after the Second World War, will continue to be with us for quite some time because we joined it as a junior partner.
Yes.
We joined it as a junior partner, and we created our new economy to the extent that if you could call the new economy according to the rules and on the basis of the rules which were created by others. These rules will be changing, and but it will take time. I think that we are not doing fast enough, but we are moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. That's reassuring. Okay.
Thank you. We have 2 or 3 more questions, I guess. So the next is from Anne Phillips. Anne?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I'm always interested in hearing other perspectives of key developments in international relations and so on. So my question for you, since you ended on such a positive note about a much brighter, freer future for everyone, is when I look at the international environment today, I see the rise of extreme nationalism, not only in the US, but in many other countries. I see the rise of authoritarianism, declining democratization and the declining appeal of democracy. So my question is, how does that fit into a brighter future? It sounds a little more Hobbesian to me than what is encouraging. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Anne. I'm Hobbesian first. Second, what I'm saying is that countries and nations will have a much more free hand than previously in choosing their own way. Whether that will be democracy or authoritarianism, it will be their choice. And I think that being a Russian and knowing international history, but especially being a Russia, I believe that the sovereignty is the absolutely prime value in terms of international relations. So let them all develop according to their historic roots along their culture. Impose democracy. Democracy, as I've said, is a much more comfortable society, form of government. It is not extremely effective. That's why democracy through the history always died, then resurrected. Remember Greek republics, then Roman Republic, then small republics of Northern Italy, then Venetian Republic, then of course Novgorod Republic, then of course the French Republic, going into Napoleonic way, and then of course Europe, which all succumbed to Hitler, except for Russia, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Britain would have succumbed to Hitler too. So democracy is a very comfortable and not extremely effective system. But when the nations choose it, let them do it, but without imposition from outside. When a democracy is imposed from outside, it brings disaster, blood, and unfreedom. So I'm not afraid of authoritarianism. I know what certain things that fascism, Nazism, or totalitarianism is profoundly unhealthy and immoral. But authoritarian, well, the world has been authoritarian through most of its history, and probably in one of my works I said that we are moving towards the age of a lot of different types of rule, but mostly dominated by authoritarian democracy or democratic authoritarianism. That would be if I could judge from here, the path of humanity, whatever that is.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. The next question is from Julie Newton. Julie, from the United States or France, where are you, Julie?
Hi, Sasha. I'm actually in the UK. I'm at Oxford, yes, Sergey Alexandrovich, thank you very much for once again a very interesting lecture. Very much enjoyed hearing you as always. I was curious if you could, come back to that wretched coronavirus, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, and just to talk about the implications for Russia's outlook and its position on the international stage in this era of pandemic. And I'm also curious, you mentioned that the pandemic in one way helped Russia avoid or escape a focus on domestic problems that it needs to. But I could also see as this pandemic has exacerbated domestic problems and exacerbated Russia's economic weakness, combined, of course, with the collapse in the oil price, a need to put greater focus on domestic problems. Do you see a case where Russian foreign policy may be less of a focus and there be more focus on domestic issues?
Thank you. I 3 times already mentioned my unwillingness to debate the after effects of the present crisis. But I will, out of politeness and friendship, I will try to answer some of your questions. One is, of course, the crisis around this epidemics is used by ruling elites all over the world to cover up their former mistakes or to rationalize their impotence. I mean, the world has been moving in the very wrong direction for many years, not dealing with the various profound problems which were building up. I hope that Russia, I'm not unhappy with this debate about coronavirus, exactly that it diverts also Russia from dealing with the real problems. So in terms of foreign policy, I must say that, of course, Russia have to offer the world some good ideas how it will develop. But watching that world, I would say we have to go back to one of the grand strategic ideas of the Russian Empire: armed neutrality. Because I mean, fighting the United States is stupid. The United States is fighting itself. Going into one crisis after another is endless. So even if it is cheap, and at this juncture, most of our involvement in the Middle East is not only cheap but profitable, well, it could be done, but not more than that, and not taking sides. But we could not stop to being Russia, and stop providing for deterrence of the United States, and thus we could not avoid the necessity of being an enemy for those who want to have an enemy, just by being us. So we have to, and of course we have to do with our internal affairs. That is more and more, and that must be the main direction of the effort of the Russian elite. There is no question about that, and we have procrastinated for too long. But I avoided a direct answer, as you see. But if you wanted a direct answer, I don't think you would get it at this juncture. Again, I'm referring to Zhou Enlai's dictum. It's too early to say. We are only at the beginning of the unraveling of a series of crises on the background of those crises which we have been having before.
Well, thank you. As you probably know, there is a theory that Zhou Enlai did not really understood the question. Did not really understand the question, and he was talking about the Great French Revolution, but not. Well, he was talking about the current events at that time, at 1968 revolution, but he was asked about the Great French Revolution.
Well, I've heard about that too, but I use this dictum of Zhou Enlai as a cover-up.
Okay. So the next question is about history again, and that's the last but one, from Sergey Solovyov, if he's here.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for the lecture again. It was very interesting. Actually, my question, I think it's simple, and its nature was the same of the previous one. It's how important the domestic competition between Russian regions, and should Russia to concentrate more now on domestic issues rather than foreign policy?
Yes, I mean, the answer is, first of all, yes, it should concentrate. But I don't think we could just go away from foreign policy activities or security policy because we are here. When we tried to refrain from that and to shed our responsibilities, Gorbachev in 1980s, we collapsed. So foreign policy and security policy is at the core of Russian national identity, as though most of the identities of great powers. You couldn't be a great power without a strong foreign policy and great foreign policy ideas. I'm criticizing Russian policy also for the lack of big ideas as of yet. So, yes, as much concentration on internal affairs as possible, but you could not, even if you wish, get rid of the responsibility of great power. When we tried to do that, we collapsed. I wanted to, as when I was your age, not a bit older maybe, but I wanted Russia to become a normal country. And then I found in the mid-90s that we could not be a noble country because we are abnormal. We are Russia. That's it.
Right. Thank you very much. The last question is from Andrei Kalinichev, but he has left us, so, but it's an interesting question, so I'll read it then. He wanted to ask that if he understood you correctly, the decline of the US and Western economical and military global domination brings us to the world more kind of freedom and prosperity. And so he asks, who is going to be the drivers of those freedom and prosperity? Is it only China and Russia in your view? And maybe there are other potential drivers.
Oh no, I mean, countries which will not be robbed through the system of military, political, and economic domination will be able, I hope, and I assume, will be able to deliver much faster, like they have been doing already during the last 20 years. If China wouldn't have been inadvertently covered by the fact that, or protected by the fact that it could rely on Russian strategic might, cost. And I think that most countries of Asia, except for some Middle Eastern countries, clearly India, some Africans eventually. Europe will be stagnating, and going slowly down, but still it will be a very affluent piece, a nice piece, hopefully, of the world. So it will not be only China. Everybody is concentrating on China now for one simple reason, because there is a remnant, one of the remnants of the Western domination is domination in informational field. Mr. Trump and the American elite now concentrates on China. So everybody is talking about China, 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 China. China is a very important player. And although it will lose some of its energy during this crisis, and clearly it will continue to grow. But China will be only one of the big players in the future world. Of course, and it could be a leading player if it chooses to part with this historic tradition of the Middle Kingdom, of which you know, Professor Lukin, more than anybody else, whereas China, through the system of tributes, provided for a ring of vassal nations around it. That is impossible in this world. Small nations could be vassal to China, well, but China now is surrounded by big and proud countries like India, Turkey, Persia, Russia, and the others. So if China will take the position of Germany, and I'm referring to one of the previous questions of Zanzibar, in Europe, and that is first among equals, it will prosper. If not, well, and it will be the leading power in the world in 20, 30 years, or else it will be one of the big powers because it will be balanced by others. But I do not see the world dominated by China, all the more that I suspect that China could not develop a military force and a capability within thinkable period of time to support its hegemony, like United States did.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Karaganov. We'll have to stop here. If we had quite a large audience, if you wish to have more answers, you could read Professor Karaganov's chapter in the book, which is called Russia in in a Changing World, published earlier this year by Palgrave Macmillan. If you didn't have time to download it now from the chat, I can send it to you if you wish. And I am actually the editor of this book, so it's kind of advertisement.
And not only your editor, you ordered the chapter. You persuaded me to write it, because
yes.
otherwise I would
persuaded Professor Karaganov to write it. So thank you very much, Professor, for being with us, and thank you for everyone for participating. We'll have next seminar on June the 10th with Thierry de Montbrial. And if you wish to listen to others or to watch other seminars, we have already 14 of them. Please please follow our website. You can just browse or you can just Google Eurasian Online Seminar. It comes first. Well, thank you very much. See you next time, probably on the 10th.
thank you, and sorry for the thunderstorm.
Yeah. Right. All right. Yeah, I saw him. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.